I took this job for the silence, but the silence out here screams. They gave me a list of rules today. Rule number 6 says, never under any circumstances answer a scream that sounds like your own voice. An hour ago, from the tree line below, I heard myself begging for my life. Now everything has gone quiet again, and the silence is worse. The silence is listening. The final 10 miles of the journey weren't on any public map. The road, a term I use generously, was more like a suggestion carved into the earth, a pair of rugged tire tracks that wound deeper and deeper into the belly of Yellowstone's untamed heartland. My pickup truck groaned in protest, its suspension tested by every rock and rut. Around me, the world as I knew it had simply ceased to exist. There were no power lines, no cell towers, no distant hum of civilization. There was only the endless breathing expanse of the forest. Lodgepole pines, ancient and tall, stood like silent sentinels on either side of the path, their dense canopy swallowing the sunlight and casting the road in a perpetual twilight. My name is Leo, and this was supposed to be the first day of my dream. Ever since I was a kid, suffocated by the concrete and noise of the city, I dreamt of this. Open sky, clean air, a quiet solitude where the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the call of an eagle. I'd worked my tail off to get this posting, acing every exam, pushing myself in physical training, all for a spot as a fire lookout ranger in one of the most remote stations in the country, Watchtower 4. When I finally saw it, my breath caught in my chest. Perched on the crest of a high ridge, it was exactly as I'd pictured. A rustic wooden cabin-like room sat atop a skeletal steel framework that lifted it 100 feet into the air. It looked like a lonely sentinel, majestic and completely isolated, with a 360-degree view of a rolling green ocean of trees that stretched to every horizon. This was it, my castle in the sky. A dusty Park Service Jeep was parked at the base of the tower. Leaning against it was a man who seemed as old and weathered as the landscape itself. This had to be Al, the senior ranger I'd spoken to briefly on the radio. As I killed the engine and stepped out, the silence that enveloped me was absolute. It was a physical presence, heavy and profound. "You must be Leo," he said. His voice was gravelly, like stones grinding together. It wasn't unkind, just tired, deeply tired. He had a face carved from granite, with lines around his eyes that weren't from laughter. They were the tracks of long nights and too much looking into the distance. "That's me. Al, it's an honor," I said, extending a hand. He took it, his grip firm but brief. "Let's get your gear up." "Sun sets fast out here," he grunted, already turning to grab my duffel bag from the truck bed. The climb up the tower's stairs was a dizzying ascent. The metal steps clanged under our boots, the sound shockingly loud in the stillness. With every level we climbed, the view grew more spectacular. I couldn't help but stop and stare, a wide grin plastered on my face. "Wow, you were right. The pictures don't do it justice." Al didn't pause. "It's a view," was all he said, his gaze not on the majestic landscape but scanning the dark, impenetrable line of trees at the edge of the clearing. It was the first flicker of strangeness, the first hint that his perspective and mine were worlds apart. I saw beauty. He seemed to see a perimeter that needed watching. The room at the top was Spartan but perfect. A single cot was pushed against one wall, a small desk with radio equipment against another. In the center sat the iconic Osborne firefinder, a circular map table used to pinpoint smoke sightings. But the real feature was the windows. They wrapped around the entire room, offering that promised, breathtaking panorama. It felt like being in a glass box at the top of the world, a safe, secure perch to watch over the wilderness. Al began the handover with a mechanical efficiency. He showed me the quirks of the propane generator, the protocol for radio check-ins, the location of the first aid kit, and the emergency rations. It was all standard procedure, stuff I'd learned in training. I nodded along, my mind still half distracted by the sun beginning its slow golden descent towards the distant mountain peaks. He finished his checklist and fell silent, his eyes fixed on me. The atmosphere in the small room shifted, growing heavy. The casual professional demeanor was gone, replaced by a somber gravity that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "All right, kid, the official part's over," he said, his voice low. "Now for the unofficial part, the important part. He reached into the pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was laminated, its edges yellowed and smooth with age, the text faded from countless readings. He laid it on the map table between us. "These are the rules for the night shift," he said. And the way he said it, a flat, ritualistic statement, sent a cold spike of unease through me. "It's not in any park service manual, but you follow them. You follow them to the letter. No questions. You understand?" I looked down at the paper. The title, typed in a simple, no-nonsense font, read, "Tower 4, Night Procedures." I chuckled, my initial unease giving way to amusement. It was a hazing ritual. Of course. The old veteran messing with the rookie. I'd heard stories about things like this. I picked it up, a grin spreading across my face as I began to read. After sunset, all doors and windows must be locked from the inside. No exceptions. If you hear knocking at the base of the tower, especially in a pattern of 3, knock, 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 do not respond and do not shine your light down. It is not human. Between the hours of 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., the long-range radio may pick up transmissions of familiar voices asking for help. It is an imitation. Power down the equipment immediately. You may observe strange, silent lights hovering over the geyser basin to the north. Do not watch them for more than 5 seconds. They notice when they are being watched. If the wolves in the valley suddenly stop howling, turn off all interior lights and move away from the windows for 1 hour. The silence means something else is hunting. Never, under any circumstances, answer a scream that sounds like your own voice. My grin faltered, then vanished completely as I read the last rule. The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. This went beyond a simple prank. There was a specificity to it, a bizarre, unnerving logic that was deeply unsettling. I looked up at Al, expecting a crack in his stony facade, a hint of a smile to let me know I was in on the joke. There was nothing. His face was deadly serious, his eyes boring into mine. "All right, you got me," I said, trying to force a laugh. "That's a good one. It is not human. Very creative. So where are the real night procedures?" Al didn't move. He didn't even blink. "That is the real list," he said, his voice flat and cold. "Every person who has manned this tower since the 1960s has followed that list. The ones who didn't, they didn't get to leave." The air in the room felt thick and hard to breathe. The last rays of sunlight were bleeding out of the sky, and the shadows in the room were deepening. My heart started to beat a little faster. This guy was either an incredible actor or genuinely unhinged. "Al, come on," I stammered. "What is this? What are you talking about?" He looked away from me then, his gaze drifting to the window, to the vast, darkening forest. "The guy you're replacing. David. Good kid. A lot like you. Eager. Thought he knew better." Al's voice dropped to a near whisper. "He was on his 2nd week. His wife was visiting her parents a few states over. He got a call on the radio one night. Her voice, crying, said she'd gotten lost on a back road, car broke down." He paused, and the silence stretched, filled only by the low moan of the wind outside. "David broke rule number 3, Al finished, his eyes still fixed on the woods. He answered. He spent an hour on the radio, trying to calm her down, trying to get her location. When the search party got here the next morning, all they found was the radio, still warm. David was gone. He finally turned back to me, and the look in his eyes was one of profound, soul-deep exhaustion. It was the look of a man who had seen things he could never unsee. "We are not here just to watch for fires, kid. We are here to watch, and to listen, and to follow the damn rules so we live to see the sun rise. That is the job." He tapped a finger on the laminated paper. "Read them, memorize them, live by them, don't be David." With that, he turned and walked to the trapdoor in the floor that led to the stairs. "My shift is over. You're on your own now. Radio check-in is at 0700. Don't call before then, unless the forest is actually on fire. And even then, think twice." He opened the hatch, and without another word or a look back, he descended, his heavy boots clanging on the metal steps, the sound growing fainter and fainter until it was swallowed by the immense silence. I heard the jeep door slam shut far below, the engine roar to life, and then the sound of it driving away, fading into the vast emptiness of the park. And then I was alone. The silence that returned was different now. It was no longer peaceful, it was predatory. Every creak of the aging tower, every whisper of the wind against the glass, seemed charged with a malevolent intent. The sun had completely disappeared, leaving behind a bruised purple twilight. A sea of impenetrable darkness was rising from the forest floor, swallowing the world tree by tree. I stood there for a long time, the strange, ominous list clutched in my hand. My rational mind screamed at me that it was an elaborate, cruel prank, a psychological game to test the rookie. But the look in Al's eyes, the story about David, it felt chillingly real. My gaze fell on the main door to the room. I walked over to it, my footsteps echoing loudly in the small space. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the heavy deadbolt. With a loud, definitive thunk, I shot the bolt home. Then I went to each window, checking the locks, making sure they were secure, just as rule number 1 dictated. I was acting on an instinct I didn't understand, a primal fear that bypassed all logic. As the last of the light died, and Yellowstone was plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness, I sat at the desk with the list laid out before me, the faint glow of a small desk lamp, the only island of light in a universe of black. The feeling was no longer one of excitement or peace. It was the cold, creeping realization that I might not have taken a job, but walked into a trap. My first shift in the vast silent wilderness of Yellowstone was about to begin, and the solitude I had craved my entire life now felt like a death sentence. If you want to find out what horrors the darkness held for me, and whether these rules are a prank or the only thing keeping me alive, please subscribe and hit that like button. You have no idea how much I don't want to be alone tonight. The first hour of complete darkness was a battle waged entirely within my own mind. One half of my brain, the logical, trained and rational half, insisted on normalcy. It told me to brew a thermos of coffee, to begin my systematic scans of the horizon with the binoculars, to log the hourly weather conditions as per standard operating procedure. It was a job like any other. The tower was old and made of wood and steel. It was supposed to make noises. The wind was a natural, constant presence. It was supposed to howl and whistle. Al was a classic old-timer, steeped in backcountry folklore and possessed of a morbid sense of humor. His story was a ghost story, a rite of passage designed to put the fear of God into the new guy so I wouldn't do anything stupid. It all made perfect, logical sense. But the other half of my brain, the older, more primitive part that was wired to fear the dark, wasn't listening to logic. It was fixated on the deadbolt I had thrown, the crisp finality of its sound. It was replaying the dead serious look in Al's eyes, a look that no prank, however committed, could ever fully replicate. It had taken his words and etched them onto the back of my eyelids. The ones who didn't, they didn't get to leave. This part of my brain was in control of my adrenal glands. It made my hand shake as I poured the coffee. It made my neck prickle with the phantom sensation of being watched. It made me flinch at every groan of the tower's timbers, interpreting each sound not as a symptom of age, but as a prelude to something monstrous. For a while, I let the rational side win. I performed my duties with a forced, deliberate calm. I sat at the central map table, the Osborne Firefinder a solid, reassuring presence under my fingertips. I swept the horizon with my high-powered binoculars, quadrant by quadrant. The world outside the windows was a void, an ocean of absolute blackness that my eyes couldn't penetrate beyond the first few feet of the clearing. It was a moonless, overcast night, and the darkness felt solid, like a physical barrier. It was humbling, and for the first 10 minutes almost peaceful. The dream I'd chased was still there, flickering under the surface of my rising anxiety. The perfect solitude, the profound quiet. But the quiet wasn't empty. The longer I sat in it, the more I began to realize it was filled with tiny, almost imperceptible sounds that my city-numbed ears were only now starting to process. The gentle hiss of the propane lamp, the faint, high-frequency hum of the dormant radio equipment, my own breathing, unnervingly loud in the confined space, the frantic, thumping beat of my own heart, a drum signaling my unease to an unseen audience. By 10 p.m., the novelty had worn off, and a deep-seated loneliness had begun to set in. This was a different kind of alone than I had ever experienced. It wasn't just the absence of people, it was the absence of everything. Out here, a shout would be swallowed by the trees before it traveled 100 yards. A scream would be answered only by the wind. I was an astronaut in a tin can, marooned at the top of the world, and the vast, dark forest below was my hostile, alien planet. I tried the main radio just to hear a voice. I switched it to the Regional Park Service channel and keyed the mic. Tower 4 to Regional Dispatch, just a routine radio check. The speaker crackled back, not with a voice but with a wall of empty static, a thick, rushing sound like a waterfall. I tried again. Same result. The isolation was more complete than Al had let on. The atmospheric conditions, the mountains, whatever the reason, I was cut off. The knowledge landed in my stomach like a cold stone. There would be no calling for help. There would be no friendly voice to break the monotony. I was entirely, irrevocably, on my own. I decided to get up and pace, just to burn off some of the nervous energy. The wooden floorboards of the cabin creaked under my weight. With each step, the entire structure seemed to sway slightly, a gentle rhythmic motion that I knew was normal for a tower of this height, but which now felt deeply precarious, as if I were balanced on a matchstick. I kept my back to the windows, an irrational instinct telling me that if I couldn't see out, then nothing out there could see in. It was just before midnight when I heard the first sound. It was faint, so faint that at first I thought I'd imagined it. A soft thump from far below. I froze mid-pace, my head cocked, straining to hear. Nothing, only the ceaseless whisper of the wind moving through the pines. I let out a slow breath. A branch. A pine cone falling from a great height and hitting the packed earth at the base of the tower. It had to be. I resumed my pacing, my boots feeling heavier on the floorboards. 5 minutes later, it came again. This time, clearer, unmistakable. Knock. A single, deliberate rap. It wasn't the sound of something falling. It was the sound of a knuckle on a solid surface. But what solid surface? There was no door at the base of the tower, only the steel legs and the open staircase. Was it hitting one of the support beams? I stood motionless, my blood turning to ice water in my veins. My mind raced, desperately searching for a rational explanation. A large bird. A woodpecker, perhaps. No, not at this hour, and the sound was too dull, too heavy. An animal, maybe a bear rubbing against the structure? Possible, but the sound was so intentional. I found myself staring at the laminated list on the desk, my eyes drawn to the second rule as if it were a magnet. If you hear knocking at the base of the tower, especially in a pattern of 3, knock, 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 do not respond and do not shine your light down. It is not human. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was just 1 knock, not 3. That meant something, right? It was just a coincidence, a single anomalous sound in a forest full of them. I was letting the old ranger's spooky stories get to me, letting my imagination run wild in the dark. I took a deep, shuddering breath and forced myself to sit back down at the desk. "Get a grip, Leo," I whispered, the sound of my own voice startling me. I picked up the binoculars, determined to resume my duties, to force normalcy back into the night. I raised them to my eyes, but I wasn't looking at the horizon. I was pointing them straight down towards the impenetrable darkness at the foot of the stairs. I couldn't see a thing. It was like looking into a pool of ink. The rule said not to shine my light down. It didn't say anything about just looking, but the act itself felt like a transgression, a violation of a sacred commandment. I felt a surge of defiant anger. This was my post. I was the ranger. I had a right to see what was happening at the base of my own tower. My hand twitched towards the powerful spotlight mounted near the window. And then I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was sharp, clear, and perfectly spaced. It came from the base of the tower, a direct, articulate summons from the darkness. There was no mistaking it this time. It wasn't a branch. It wasn't an animal. It was a pattern. The pattern. All the air left my lungs in a silent rush. The logical half of my brain went completely quiet, utterly defeated. There was no rational explanation for this. The prank theory evaporated. No colleague would be out here, miles from any road in the dead of night, just to tap on a steel beam. The cold, stark reality of my situation washed over me. The rules were not a joke. Al was not a liar, and there was something at the bottom of the stairs. A wave of pure, unreasoning terror seized me. My body acted without my consent. I scrambled backwards, my chair scraping violently across the floor as I pushed away from the desk. I ended up in the far corner of the room, as far away from the trapdoor and the windows as I could get, my back pressed into the cold wood. I squeezed my eyes shut, as if not seeing would make me invisible. The knocking stopped. The silence that flooded back in was 1,000 times worse than the noise it replaced. It was a heavy, listening silence. It felt intelligent. It knew I was up here. It had knocked, and now it was waiting for a response. "Do not respond," the rule commanded. My mouth was dry. My tongue felt thick and useless anyway. Responding was the last thing on my mind. My only thought was to make myself as small, as quiet, as non-existent as possible. Minutes stretched into an eternity. I stayed huddled in the corner, straining my ears, listening for a footstep on the metal stairs, for the sound of something climbing. But there was nothing. Just the wind, which now sounded like a mournful sigh. Slowly, cautiously, my panic began to recede, replaced by a hyper-alert state of dread. Had it gone away? Did it give up? The thought had barely formed in my mind when a new sound began. It was not a knocking. It was a deep, resonant boom that vibrated up through the entire structure. The floor beneath me trembled. It was followed by another. Boom! It sounded like something immense was body-slamming the steel support beams. The tower shuddered, a low groan of stressed metal echoing through the cabin. Glassware on a small shelf rattled. This was not a test. This was not a question. This was an act of raw, physical aggression. Boom! 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 The thing below was trying to shake the tower apart. It was trying to bring me down. Panic took over again, but this time it was different. It wasn't paralyzing. It was energizing. I scrambled on my hands and knees to the desk, grabbed the laminated list and retreated to my corner, clutching it like a holy relic. It was all I had. It was my only defense. The booming continued, a terrifying, rhythmic assault. It felt personal. It felt hateful. I huddled on the floor, my head in my hands, reciting the rules over and over in my head like a prayer, a mantra against the violence outside. Do not respond. Do not shine your light. The assault lasted for what felt like hours. In reality, it was probably no more than 15 minutes. And then, as abruptly as it began, it stopped. The vibrations ceased. The terrifying booming was gone. All that remained was the wind and the pounding of my own blood in my ears. I didn't move for the rest of the night. I remained in that corner, wide-eyed and shivering, until the first, faint, grey light of dawn began to creep over the eastern mountains. That sliver of light was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It felt like a rescue. It felt like salvation. As the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in strokes of orange and pink, the oppressive weight of the darkness began to lift. The forest slowly resolved itself from a terrifying, monolithic blackness back into a world of individual trees. When the sun was fully up, flooding my tower with warm, golden light, I finally found the courage to move. My limbs were stiff and sore. I crept to the window, my heart still pounding, and peered down. There was nothing there. The ground was undisturbed. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign of the immense force that had battered my sanctuary. It was as if nothing had happened, but the memory of the vibrations, the sheer malicious power of it, was branded into my mind. I stumbled over to the desk. My hands were shaking so violently, it took me 3 tries to key the microphone on the short-range radio Al and I had used. Leo to Al. Al, do you copy? Over. Static. Al, please come in. Something happened last night. You have to believe me. Please answer. I broadcast on every channel, my voice cracking with desperation. There was no response. The sun was up, the world was bright and beautiful again, but the terror of the night remained. It was a cold knot of certainty in my gut. The rules were real, the threat was real, and the sun was already beginning its long, slow march across the sky, a countdown timer to the next sunset. Another night was coming, and I didn't know if I would survive it. Daylight did not bring relief. It brought a harsh clinical clarity that was in some ways more terrifying than the encompassing darkness. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating every dust mote dancing in the air, every scratch on the wooden floor, every tremor in my own hands. My sanctuary had become an evidence room, and I was the sole exhibit of a crime committed against my sanity. The majestic panorama that had so enthralled me just a day before now felt like the indifferent gaze of a vast, uncaring witness. The forest was no longer a collection of trees, but a single living entity that had tried to breach my defenses and would undoubtedly try again. Sleep was an impossibility. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the phantom vibrations of the tower shaking, heard the spectral echo of those 3 perfectly spaced knocks. I spent the day in a state of agitated exhaustion, my nerves frayed to the point of screaming. I did my duties on autopilot, logging the weather, scanning the horizon for smoke, but my actions were hollow, the motions of a ghost. My mind was trapped in the night, endlessly replaying the assault, dissecting every sound, every moment of terror. The silence of the day was a new form of torture. It was a loaded silence, pregnant with the memory of what had filled it and the promise of what would fill it again. This quiet was not peace. It was the pause between breaths of a predator. I couldn't bear it. I needed a distraction, a task, something to anchor my unraveling mind to the tangible world. I needed answers. Al was unreachable, and I was alone with a set of rules that were the only things separating me from whatever fate had befallen David. My sanctuary had become my cell, and like any desperate prisoner, I began to examine it for secrets. I started a frantic, meticulous search of the small cabin. I wasn't sure what I was looking for: a hidden message, a weapon, another set of rules, anything that could offer a sliver of explanation. I checked every drawer, ran my fingers along the underside of the desk and cot, tapped on the walls listening for hollow spaces. It was a madman's search, driven by the desperate hope that some previous occupant had left behind a clue, a key to surviving this place. My search led me to the floor. The old wooden planks were worn smooth in most places, but near the cot, one board seemed to sit slightly unevenly. My fingers, trembling with a surge of adrenaline, found a small notch along its edge. I worked my pocket knife into the gap and pried. The board resisted with a groan of old nails before coming loose. And there, nestled in the dark, dusty space between the floorboards and the insulation below, was a small leather-bound journal. My heart seized in my chest. It was slim, its cover warped by time and perhaps moisture, held shut by a brittle elastic strap. I lifted it out as if it were a holy scripture. The name David Miller was embossed in faded gold leaf on the cover. I sank onto the cot, the journal feeling impossibly heavy in my hands. This was it. This was a voice from the other side of the veil, the testament of the man who had walked this same floor, looked out these same windows, and listened to this same predatory silence. With a deep, shuddering breath, I opened it. The first few pages could have been my own. David's handwriting was neat, confident. He wrote of his awe at the beauty of Yellowstone, his excitement for the solitude, his idealistic hopes for a season spent in communion with nature. He described the arrival, the handover with a tired, grim ranger named Al, and his initial amusement at the spooky list of rules. October 3rd, he wrote. Al finally left. Have to say, he's quite the character. Handed me a list of rules that reads like something out of a horror movie. It is not human. Seriously? A pretty elaborate rookie hazing, but I'll play along. The quiet out here is incredible, though. I think I'm going to like this. I felt a profound, aching kinship with this ghost on the page. He was me. He had felt what I had felt, thought what I had thought. I read on, my own experience mirroring his. He wrote about the unnerving silence, the tricks the wind played on his ears, the growing sense of isolation. Then an entry from a few nights later made my blood run cold. October 6th. Can't sleep. Heard something outside around midnight. Knocking. 3 times. I know it was just a branch or my mind playing tricks on me, but it sounded so deliberate. I almost grabbed the spotlight. The memory of Al's face stopped me. This place is starting to get under my skin. He had heard it too. The same 3 knocks. My experience wasn't a hallucination. It was a documented event. It was real. I devoured the next few pages. David's entries became shorter, more erratic. The neat script grew tense and slanted. He wrote of his growing paranoia, his inability to sleep, his certainty that he was being watched by the vast, silent forest. He was a man documenting his own psychological decay, and I was following his path step by agonizing step. Before I could reach his final entry, the sun touched the western horizon. The sky began its spectacular daily bleed from blue to orange and blood red. The beauty of it was lost on me now. It was a warning. The approaching night sent a fresh wave of visceral fear through me. I carefully placed David's journal back in its hiding place, replaced the floorboard, and began my grim preparations. I locked the door, secured the windows, and positioned my chair in the corner of the room I had claimed the night before, the laminated list of rules on my lap. This time, I was not a skeptic. I was a believer. I was a man bracing for a siege. The second night was different. The initial hours passed in a tense, vigilant quiet. I did not attempt my duties. My entire being was focused on listening. The memory of the physical assault on the tower was still fresh, and I expected the booming to start again at any moment. But the hours ticked by and there was nothing. The forest was eerily still. Even the wolves were silent. The lack of an immediate, violent threat was somehow more unnerving. It felt calculated. It felt like the thing outside was changing its tactics. It happened at 2:35 a.m. I know the exact time because I had been glancing at my watch every 30 seconds. One moment, the long-range radio was emitting its usual gentle hiss of static. The next, the static vanished, replaced by a silence so pure and sudden that it made me jump. And then a voice filled the cabin, a voice that shattered my world. Leo, can you hear me?" It wasn't a voice like my sister's. It was my sister's. Maya. I would know it anywhere. It was her down to the slightest inflection, the unique cadence, the soft, almost musical lilt she had when she was frightened. My heart stopped, then exploded into a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Leo, please answer me. I'm scared." My logical brain, the small screaming part of me that still clung to reason, knew it was impossible. Maya was 2,000 miles away, safe in her college dorm. There was no way she could be here, broadcasting on a Park Service frequency in the middle of the Yellowstone wilderness. It was a violation of every law of physics and reality I knew. But the voice, it was perfectly, flawlessly hers. "I took a wrong turn, coming to surprise you," the voice sobbed, and the sound of her crying was a physical blow. "My car. It went off the road somewhere. It's so dark, and my phone has no signal. I saw the light in your tower. Leo, please, I'm so cold." Rule number 3 burned in my mind. It is an imitation. Power down the equipment immediately. But hearing her voice, so filled with genuine panic and pain, was a form of psychological torture so profound it bypassed all my defenses. This wasn't a monstrous scream or an inhuman knock. This was an attack on my soul. It was weaponized love. "Leo, are you there?" Her voice hitched with a sob, the exact way it did when we were kids and she'd scraped her knee. There are noises in the woods. Please, just talk to me. Just let me know you can hear me." My hand, acting of its own accord, reached for the microphone. My thumb hovered over the transmit button. What harm could it do? Just to let her know I was here. Just one word of comfort. It wouldn't be answering a call for help, it would just be talking. My entire being screamed at me to press the button, to soothe the terror in my sister's voice, to be the big brother I was supposed to be. David broke rule number 3. Hal's words echoed in the chamber of my skull. All they found was the radio still warm. What was this thing? How could it know my sister? How could it replicate her voice with such devastating accuracy? Had it somehow plucked her out of my memories? Was it reading my mind, projecting my deepest fears back at me? "Please," the voice on the radio whispered, a final desperate plea. "Don't leave me out here alone." My whole body was shaking. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes. It was a choice between my instinct, my love for my sister, and a bizarre rule on a sheet of yellowed paper. It was a choice between the man I was and the survivor I needed to become. With a choked sob, I lunged forward. my hand shooting past the microphone. I grabbed the radio's power knob and twisted it hard to the left. The voice cut off mid-syllable. The speaker fell silent. The cabin was plunged back into a quiet so absolute, so empty, that it felt like the vacuum of space. The absence of her voice was 1,000 times worse than the presence of it. I collapsed back into my chair, gasping for air, the guilt of physical weight crushing my chest. I had just listened to my sister beg for help in the dark and had abandoned her. It didn't matter if it was real or not. In that moment, the emotional reality of it was all that existed. I sat there, trembling in the silence for over an hour, until I couldn't stand it anymore. My mind, desperate for confirmation that I had made the right choice, remembered the journal. I pulled the loose floorboard up and took it out, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the pages. I flipped to the last few entries, seeking out David's final days. His second-to-last entry was written in a nearly illegible scrawl. October 12th. Night again. The knocking is constant now. Something tried to get up the stairs last night. I heard scraping on the metal. God, I'm so tired. I just want this to be over. Then the final entry, written on a new page. The handwriting was different. It was rushed, desperate, but also filled with a strange, terrifying certainty. October 14th, 3 months a.m. It's Sarah. It's my wife. She's on the radio. Oh God, she's on the radio. She says her car broke down on Highway 20, that she was coming to see me. It sounds just like her. Her voice, I can hear her crying. The rules say it's an imitation, but Al doesn't know her voice like I do. He couldn't understand. A trick can't cry like that. A trick can't sound that broken. It's her. I know it is. I have to help her. That's my wife out there. The rules be damned. Below that, a final hasty sentence was scrawled at the bottom of the page. I'm going out to find her. And that was it. The rest of the journal was empty pages. I dropped the book as if it had burned my hands. It was confirmation, cold and absolute. David had faced the same test. He had been presented with the voice of a loved one, and he had chosen love. He had chosen his humanity, and it had cost him everything. I had made the opposite choice. I had chosen the rules. I had chosen survival. I had abandoned the voice of my sister to the darkness. I was alive, but the guilt of my decision felt like its own kind of death. I looked at the list of rules on my lap, no longer seeing them as instructions, but as a prophecy of the different ways this thing in the forest would try to dismantle me, piece by agonizing piece. It had failed with brute force. It had failed with psychological warfare. I had survived 2 nights, but looking out into the impenetrable blackness, I knew with a chilling certainty that the entity was intelligent, it was patient, and it was only just beginning to learn what I was most afraid of. The aftermath of the radio incident left a permanent scar on my psyche. The tower, once a symbol of my dream, had become a chamber of perpetual penance. The guilt from my decision, choosing a cold, cryptic rule over the desperate, sobbing voice of my sister, was a poison that seeped into every waking moment. It didn't matter that my rational mind, and the chilling final words in David's journal, confirmed I had made the correct choice for survival. My heart didn't understand survival. It understood betrayal. I had failed a fundamental test of human empathy, and the silence that followed my turning of that knob was a ringing condemnation that never faded. A new, grim routine settled in. The days were no longer periods of awe and wonder, but simply a countdown. I ate without tasting, moved without thinking, and watched the sun crawl across the sky with a sense of methodical dread. The world outside the glass walls was now alien territory. I no longer saw a beautiful living ecosystem. I saw a hunting ground, and I was the staked goat. My sleep was shattered into disjointed, feverish increments, plagued by nightmares, where my sister's disembodied voice would whisper my name from dark corners of the cabin. I would wake up gasping, my own throat raw from a scream that had died before it could be born. In this new, terrifying existence, I began to cling to the sounds of the natural world as a drowning man clings to driftwood. The call of a distant hawk, the rustle of a squirrel in a nearby tree, even the incessant buzzing of flies against the window panes. These were my anchors to reality. They were sounds of life, of a world that operated on principles of biology and instinct, not on the malevolent, unknowable logic of the things that haunted the night. My greatest comfort, paradoxically, came from the most savage of these sounds, the nightly howling of the wolf packs in the valley below. Their chorus would begin shortly after dusk, a series of lonely rising notes that would swell into a complex, mournful symphony. It was a primal, haunting sound, yet it became my solace. The wolves were a known quantity. They were dangerous, yes, but they were a danger I understood. They were part of the natural order. Their howls meant that the world, however hostile, was still behaving as it should. Their voices were a sonic barrier, a proclamation that they were the apex predators of this domain. As long as they were howling, the greater, unnamed predator seemed to keep its distance. Their song was my canary in the coal mine. I developed a ritual around it. I would sit by the window, the cabin dark save for my small lantern, and I would listen. I learned to distinguish the calls of different packs, to recognize the yips of the young and the deep, resonant calls of the alphas. Their nightly concert was the only thing that kept the crushing, listening silence at bay. It filled the void, and for a few precious hours made me feel a little less alone. This fragile peace lasted for a week of nights where the only threats were the ones in my own head. I was beginning to hope, a foolish, dangerous flicker of hope, that maybe the entity had given up, that maybe I had passed its tests and it had moved on. It was on the 9th night of my posting that I learned the true meaning of fear. The evening had started like any other. The sun had set, painting the clouds in violent hues of crimson and purple. I had locked the door, secured the windows, and settled into my vigil. Right on schedule, the wolves began to sing. Their calls echoed up from the deep, wooded valleys, a familiar and reassuring sound against the backdrop of the wind. I allowed myself a small measure of relaxation, my shoulders unknotting for the first time in days. I made myself a cup of coffee, the simple domestic act a small rebellion against the madness of my situation. I was at the map table, tracing the outline of a creek with my finger when it happened. It wasn't a sound that alerted me, it was the absence of one. In the middle of a long, drawn-out howl, the entire symphony of the wolves simply stopped. It didn't fade out, it didn't taper off. It was cut, as if a switch had been flipped, plunging the entire wilderness into a silence so profound it was a physical shock. My head snapped up. The sudden void was deafening. The background noise of the forest I had grown accustomed to, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves, the very hum of the air itself, was also gone. It was a complete and total acoustic dead zone. The air in the cabin grew thick and heavy, the pressure seeming to drop. A deep instinctual terror, older and more potent than anything I had felt before, seized me. This was wrong. This was a violation of nature. My eyes darted to the list, which now lay permanently on the desk. My gaze fell upon the 5th rule. If the wolves in the valley suddenly stop howling, turn off all interior lights and move away from the windows for 1 hour. The silence means something else is hunting. There was no time for skepticism, no room for debate. My body moved with a frantic, pre-programmed efficiency born of sheer terror. In one fluid motion, I slapped the switch on my propane lantern, plunging the room into absolute darkness. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs as I felt my way across the room, my hands outstretched, bumping into the desk, the chair. The rule was explicit. Move away from the windows. The entire room was made of windows. My only option was the floor. I dropped to my stomach, the cold, rough wood a shock against my skin, and scrambled to the one spot in the room that offered the illusion of cover, the small, solid wall space beneath the main radio console. I pressed myself flat, my face turned to the side, my cheek scraping against the dusty floorboards. The darkness was total, a blackness so complete it felt like I was buried alive. I didn't dare breathe. I focused on a single task, counting the seconds, trying to build a clock in my head that would get me to the 1 hour mark, 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000. The silence outside was a living thing. It was watchful. It was waiting. Then, through the floorboards, I began to hear a new sound. It was a soft, rhythmic, shushing noise from the clearing below. A dragging sound. It was the sound of something immense, something heavy moving through the tall grass, its weight pressing the vegetation down. It was slow, methodical, and it was circling the base of the tower. Shh, shh, shh. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out. My imagination, now my worst enemy, conjured images of a colossal serpent, a slug-like horror, something vast and boneless, dragging its bulk across the earth. The sound was hypnotic and utterly terrifying. Whatever was down there, the wolves would rather face a blizzard or a forest fire than share the night with it. Something else is hunting. The dragging sound stopped directly beneath me. I held my breath until my lungs burned. My entire world was reduced to the space of a few square feet of floor, the smell of dust and old varnish, and the frantic, silent prayer that it would not look up. Then came the scraping. It was a delicate, exploratory sound. The noise of a single sharp point being drawn slowly up one of the steel support legs of the tower. It was a dry, chitinous sound, like a giant insect testing the structure. Scrape. The vibration traveled up the metal and into the floor, a faint tremor I could feel through my jaw. It was climbing. I thought of David's journal entry. I heard scraping on the metal. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. He had heard this. He had lived this. But had he turned out the lights? Had he hidden? Or had he been at the window peering into the darkness trying to see? The scraping continued its slow, deliberate ascent. 10 feet, 20, 30. It was taking its time, examining my fortress, testing it for weaknesses. I was seized by an almost unbearable urge to look. Just a peek. A quick glance to see what was making the sound. It was a primal, self-destructive curiosity, the same impulse that makes one look down from a great height. I dug my fingernails into the floorboards, anchoring myself, fighting the urge with every fiber of my being. The rule was my shield. To look would be to invite death. To be seen by this thing would be to be chosen. The scraping sound reached the level of the catwalk that encircled the cabin just outside the windows. I could now hear it at ear level. It was a dry, clicking, skittering noise. It sounded like it was walking on the metal grating. It was light on its feet now, no longer heavy and dragging. Was it changing its form? Could it do that? A new sound joined the skittering. A soft, wet tapping noise against the window pane nearest to me. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't aggressive like the knocking had been. This was gentle, curious, inquisitive, like a bird's beak against the glass. But this was no bird. This was the hunter that had silenced the wolves. I risked turning my head just enough to face the wall, pressing my ear against the wood, as if it could somehow offer more protection. The tapping moved to the next window, and the next. It was circling the cabin, peering into each pane of glass, its strange, delicate appendages testing the barrier between us. It was looking for me. The hour felt like a lifetime. Every second was a new universe of terror. I was certain it would find a way in, that the glass would suddenly shatter, that the door would splinter, but it didn't. Its exploration remained just that, an examination. It was patient. It was studying its environment. It was studying me. And then, as my internal clock neared what I prayed was the 1-hour mark, I heard it. Faintly at first, then growing in strength, a single mournful howl rose from the valley. It was answered by another, and then another. The wolves were singing again. Their chorus swelled, reclaiming the night, pushing back against the unholy silence. The sound was a reprieve, a pardon. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my life. From outside the window, the skittering, tapping sounds ceased instantly. There was a moment of absolute stillness, and then I heard the heavy, dragging sound again, moving away from the tower, receding back into the darkness of the forest. Shh, shh, shh. It faded into the distance until it was gone, leaving only the wind and the triumphant, defiant howls of the wolves. I lay on the floor for another half an hour, unmoving until I was sure. I was drenched in a cold sweat, my body trembling uncontrollably. When I finally found the strength to push myself up, my muscles screamed in protest. I stumbled to the lantern and, with a shaking hand, managed to light it. The warm yellow glow filled the cabin, pushing the last of the oppressive darkness into the corners. I didn't dare approach the windows until the sun was fully up. When I did, I scanned the clearing below with my binoculars, my heart in my throat. Just like before, there was nothing. No trail in the grass, no strange markings in the dirt, no evidence whatsoever. The only proof of the night's events was the lingering terror in my soul and a newfound, horrifying understanding of my place in this wilderness. I wasn't a ranger in a watchtower. I was a mouse in a wall, listening as the homeowners moved about their business. I was a tiny, insignificant creature, living on the fringes of a world ruled by something ancient and vast. I hadn't survived an attack. I had merely, through sheer blind obedience to a dead man's rules, managed to go unnoticed. And as the sun began its ascent, I knew that every coming night would be another test, another chance for the hunter to finally catch my scent. The nights that followed the silencing of the wolves were a different kind of hell. The previous encounters had been direct assaults, a physical battering, an emotional manipulation, a primal hunt. They were terrifying, but they were external. There was a clear demarcation between me, the victim, and it, the aggressor. That boundary was now beginning to dissolve. The entity had been at my door, in my ears, and outside my window. Now it was trying to get into my head. The days became a hazy, surreal landscape of fatigue and hypervigilance. The lack of proper sleep was taking a severe toll. My thoughts grew fragmented, my ability to focus shattered. I would find myself staring at a single spot on the wall for 20 minutes, lost in a looping internal monologue of fear and regret. The world perceived through the tower's windows seemed to lose its depth, looking flat and unreal like a painted backdrop. At times, I would catch a fleeting movement in my peripheral vision, a flicker of shadow in the tree line, a distortion in the air, only to have it vanish when I turned to look directly. I didn't know if these were tricks of the light, symptoms of my profound exhaustion, or the entity's new, more subtle way of watching me during the day. My own reflection became a source of anxiety. I'd catch my image in the dark glass of a window at dusk and feel a jolt of alarm, a moment of non-recognition. The man staring back was a stranger. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, sunk deep into dark, bruised-looking sockets. His face was gaunt, his skin pale and stretched taut over his cheekbones. He looked hunted. He looked haunted. He looked like the next David. The tower itself, my supposed sanctuary, was turning against me. Its familiar sounds became alien and menacing. The groan of the wood in the wind sounded like a low-pained moan. The hum of the radio equipment seemed to morph into whispering voices just at the edge of my hearing, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I began to doubt my own senses completely. Was that a floorboard creaking, or was something shifting its weight just outside the door? Was that the wind whistling around the antenna, or was it a high-pitched mocking laugh? Paranoia became the very air I breathed. It was during this period of slow, grinding psychological erosion that I first heard the scream. It was my third week in the tower, a night thick with a cold, clinging fog that reduced visibility to near zero. The world outside was a swirling expanse of grey, muffling all sound and creating an intense, claustrophobic atmosphere. The wolves were silent, but not in the sudden, terrifying way they had been before. This was a natural quiet, the kind brought on by bad weather. The scream came from the mist, from the direction of the deep ravine to the south. It was faint, distorted by the fog, but it was unmistakably a human cry of pain and terror. I froze, my coffee mug halfway to my lips. My first thought was of a hiker, someone who had gotten lost and injured. My duty as a ranger, the very reason I had taken this job, screamed at me to get on the radio, to grab the spotlight, to help. But then I remembered where I was. There were no hiking trails for 50 miles in any direction. No one came out here. I strained to listen, my body rigid with tension. The sound didn't repeat. There was only the thick, oppressive silence of the fog. I spent the rest of that night staring into the swirling grey, my mind a battlefield between my ingrained duty and the chilling lessons I had learned. 2 nights later, it happened again. This time, there was no fog. The sky was clear and littered with a billion cold, indifferent stars. The scream was much closer. It ripped through the night air, sharp and filled with an agony that made my own throat ache in sympathy. It was a man's voice, and it was cut short with a sickening, wet gurgle. I spent the remainder of the night with my back to the wall, knees drawn up to my chest, convinced the hunter was claiming another victim just beyond my sight. It was the following night that the true, unthinkable horror began. The night was still and calm. I was trying to read a tattered paperback novel I'd found in a drawer, a futile attempt to impose a sense of normalcy on the insanity. Suddenly, a sound pierced the quiet, a scream. But this time it was different. It wasn't faint or distant. It was coming from directly below the tower, and I recognized the voice. Every muscle in my body locked. The book fell from my hands. It was a voice I knew better than any other in the world. It was mine. It was a perfect, flawless replica. It wasn't an imitation. It was an acoustic photograph of my own terror. The pitch, the timbre, the specific ragged way my voice breaks when I'm afraid. It was all there. The scream was one of pure, unadulterated panic, and it ended with a desperate, gurgling cry of my own name. "Leo!" I clamped my hands over my ears, but it was useless. The sound was not just outside. It was inside me, a phantom echo in my own larynx. I scrambled back, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. My eyes flew to the laminated list, and the final rule seemed to glow with a malevolent energy. Never, under any circumstances, answer a scream that sounds like your own voice. This was it. The final test. The most insidious, mind-breaking rule of them all. The knocking was a test of nerve. The radio was a test of emotion. The silence was a test of discipline. This was a test of identity. "Help me!" The voice that was my own voice cried from the darkness below. "Oh God, please, somebody help. I fell from the stairs. I think my leg is broken." The cognitive dissonance was a physical force, a wave of nausea and vertigo that threatened to knock me off my feet. How could this be? I was here inside the cabin, whole and unharmed, yet I could hear myself suffering, terrified just 100 feet below. A part of my brain, fractured by fear and exhaustion, entertained the insane possibility. What if I was the one down there? What if this person in the tower was the copy, the imitation, and the real me was bleeding out in the dark? "Leo, are you up there?" my voice called, its tone shifting from panic to a desperate, pleading hope. "I see the light. Please answer me. I'm hurt bad. Just call for help." I squeezed my eyes shut, my knuckles white as I pressed my fists against my skull. "Don't answer. It's a trick. David's journal didn't mention this, but it's the same pattern. A different lure for a different trap." But the logic was a thin, flimsy shield against the sheer psychological horror of the situation. To ignore a stranger's cry for help is one thing. To ignore your sister's is another. But to ignore your own? It was a violation of the very concept of self. When I remained silent, the voice changed again. The pleading was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp anger that was also uncannily my own. "Don't you ignore me, you coward. I know you're up there. I can hear you breathing." A cold dread washed over me. It knew this wasn't a recording. It wasn't a simple mimic. It was interactive. It was intelligent. And it was listening. "What's the matter, Leo?" the voice sneered, the sound of it seeming to come from all directions at once now. "Afraid to come to the window? Afraid of what you might see?" I was paralyzed, huddled on the floor, trying to make myself as small as possible. I was no longer in a watchtower. I was a child hiding from a monster under the bed. The voice began to talk, a continuous tormenting monologue in my own cadence. It was a psychological vivisection. It whispered my deepest insecurities, things I had barely admitted to myself. "Still thinking about Maya?" it taunted softly. "Still hearing her cry for you on that radio? You just turned it off, left her for dead. That's what you do, isn't it? You hide, you survive, you let everyone else take the fall." Tears streamed down my face, hot and silent. It was plucking the rawest nerves of my guilt, twisting the knife with surgical precision. "David was a better man than you," it continued, its tone conversational, almost pitying. "He had courage. He chose love. What are you choosing, Leo? Hiding in the dark? Clutching a list of rules written by ghosts?" Al knows you're not going to make it. He saw the weakness in you the moment you arrived. He's probably already filling out the paperwork for your replacement." The attack was relentless. It was my own voice articulating my own worst fears, giving them sound and substance in the oppressive darkness. I started rocking back and forth, a low moan escaping my lips, my hands still clamped over my ears. I was losing my grip on reality, the line between my own thoughts and the voice from outside blurring into a terrifying, indistinguishable hum. And then it laughed. It was my laugh, a deep, genuine belly laugh, but it was utterly devoid of humor. It was a sound of pure nihilistic mockery. It was the sound of a predator delighting in the suffering of its prey. It was the most horrific sound I had ever heard. The sound echoed in the clearing below, a monument to my own unraveling. The laughter went on for a full minute, a sustained acoustic assault that hammered at the last foundations of my sanity. And when it finally stopped, the silence that followed was absolute. The rest of the night passed in a state of catatonic shock. I didn't move from my spot on the floor. I simply stared into the darkness, my mind a hollowed-out cavern. The entity had done more than just scare me. It had stolen a part of me. It had taken my voice, my fears, my very identity, and weaponized them against me. It had shown me that it didn't need to break down the door to get to me. It could simply dismantle me from the inside out. As the first gray light of dawn tentatively touched the sky, I crawled to the window. I looked at my reflection in the glass. The stranger was still there, his face a mask of hollow-eyed terror. But this time I saw something new. For a fleeting, heart-stopping second, I saw his lips curl into a faint, mirthless smile. And in the profound, traumatized silence of my own mind, I could almost hear the faint, echoing sound of my own laughter. The battle for the tower was one thing, but I was now locked in a battle for myself, and I was terrifyingly uncertain which one of me was going to win. The longest night of my life was drawing to a close, but the deepest horrors were yet to come. I had survived the physical, the emotional, and the psychological, but I was about to face the existential. Before we uncover the final grim truth of Watchtower 4, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and comment below. What do you believe these things in the forest truly are? The aftermath of the auditory self-assault was a descent into a new layer of hell. My identity felt fractured, my own thoughts no longer a safe haven. The entity had shown its hand. Its ultimate goal wasn't just to kill me, but to erase me, to replace me with a hollow echo of my own fear. I spent the daylight hours in a state of near catatonia, moving through my duties with the jerky, disconnected motions of a marionette. I was a ghost, haunting the final hours of my own life, convinced that the approaching night would be my last. The sunset that evening was grotesque, a smear of septic-looking oranges and purples that felt less like a natural phenomenon and more like a wound opening in the sky. As darkness consumed the world, I didn't retreat to my corner. There was no point. Hiding felt futile. Instead, I sat in the chair at the center of the room, by the Osborne Firefinder, the laminated list of rules laid out before me. It was the only solid thing in a world that had become fluid and nightmarish. I felt a strange, fatalistic calm settle over me. The terror was still there, a cold, hard knot in my gut. But the frantic, screaming panic had been burned away, leaving behind only the exhausted resignation of a soldier in a trench awaiting the final, inevitable charge. The night began with a full-scale orchestral performance of its greatest hits. First came the knocking. Knock, knock, knock. It was louder this time, more insistent, less a question and more a demand. I ignored it. Then the long-range radio crackled to life, bypassing the power switch entirely. My sister's voice, raw with manufactured panic, filled the room. I ignored it. Shortly after, the wolves fell silent, and the heavy, dragging sound began its circuit around the tower's base, accompanied by the delicate, inquisitive tapping against the glass. I remained perfectly still, my eyes fixed on the map of a world that no longer felt real. This was no longer a hunt. It was a siege, and the entity was throwing its entire arsenal at my walls. But the walls of my sanity were already crumbling from within. None of it landed with the same force. It was familiar now, predictable. And that, I realized with a sudden chilling clarity, was the problem. It was testing my reactions, gauging my immunity. It was learning. Around 3 a.m., the assault stopped. All of it. The knocking, the radio, the scraping, everything ceased at once. A profound, unnatural quiet descended again. This was the most terrifying silence yet. It was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of held breath. It was the moment before the lightning strike. It knew its old methods were no longer working as intended. It was about to try something new. And then I heard it, a sound so mundane, so utterly out of place in this theater of the bizarre, that it shocked me more than any scream. It was the faint metallic jingle of a set of keys coming from the base of the tower. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of a key sliding into a lock. A lock I didn't know existed. The heavy metal door to the staircase, the one Al had simply pulled shut, was now being unlocked. A solid, definitive click echoed up the stairwell. My blood turned to slush in my veins. There were no locks on that door. I had checked. I had been up and down those stairs a dozen times. A voice drifted up from the bottom of the stairs. It was Al's voice, gravelly, tired, and laced with a convincing concern. "Leo, you in there, kid? It's Al. I had a bad feeling. Figured I'd come check on you. Everything all right?" My mind reeled. It couldn't be him, not at this hour. The radio check-in wasn't for another 4 hours, but the sound was perfect. It wasn't a disembodied voice on the radio. It had direction, acoustics, presence. And the keys, the lock. Those details were too specific, too grounded in reality to be a mere trick of sound. "Leo, answer me," his voice called, a little closer now. He was on the stairs. I could hear the heavy thud of his boots on the metal treads, the slow, steady rhythm of his ascent. Had a report of some atmospheric interference, wanted to make sure the equipment was holding up. Open the trapdoor. My hand instinctively went to the heavy bolt on the trapdoor in the floor. My heart hammered against my ribs. Was it possible? Had he come back? Was I finally being rescued from this nightmare? Hope, a feeling I thought had been permanently extinguished, sparked painfully in my chest. I crawled towards the trapdoor, my hand hovering over the lock. But something was wrong. Al's voice. It was too calm, too relaxed. The real Al was a man perpetually on edge, his voice always tight with a tension he couldn't hide. This voice was casual, easy. It was the voice of a man coming to check on faulty equipment, not the voice of a man entering a known hunting ground in the middle of the night. The ones who didn't get to leave. The thought was a splash of ice water on my desperate hope. This was the final, most sophisticated trap. It had learned that inhuman sounds only inspired fear. It had learned that voices of loved ones inspired an emotional, but ultimately deniable panic. So now it was trying something else. It was trying the mundane. It was trying the plausible. It was cloaking itself in the guise of a routine, logical event. "Come on, kid. Open up. It's freezing out here," the voice of Al said. It was just below the trapdoor now. I could almost feel the vibration of his presence through the wood. My desperate hope curdled into a new, more profound terror. I scrambled backwards, crab walking away from the trapdoor until my back hit the far wall. I didn't make a sound. There was a long pause. The silence stretched. "All right," the voice sighed, a perfect imitation of Al's weary resignation. "Have it your way." There was a soft thud against the underside of the trapdoor, then a splintering crack. A second thud, louder this time, and the thick wood of the door bulged upwards, the bolt straining against its housing. With a final explosive crack, the entire lock assembly tore free from the doorframe. The trapdoor swung open with a violent bang, and something pulled itself up into the room. It was tall, impossibly so, its head scraping the ceiling of the 10-foot-high cabin. Its form was a blasphemy against anatomy, a vaguely humanoid silhouette that seemed to be made of stitched-together shadows and fractured moonlight. It was not solid, but it had weight. It moved with a disjointed, twitching grace that was both fluid and fundamentally wrong. It had no discernible face, just a smooth, blank surface where features should have been. But I knew with a certainty that went deeper than sight that it was looking at me. It took a step into the room, its foot landing on the wooden floor with a wet, soft impact. The illusion of Al was gone. The creature stood in its true form, a thing from outside of reality. It turned its blank head slowly, scanning the room. Then it spoke, and the sound that came from it was the oral equivalent of its physical form, a chaotic, horrifying collage. It spoke with my sister's voice. "Leo?" Then with my own. "Why are you hiding?" Then with Al's. "There's nothing to be afraid of." It cycled through them, the voices overlapping, distorting, a symphony of my stolen terrors. My mind finally broke. I let out a choked, terrified whimper. The creature's blank head snapped in my direction. It had located me. It took another lurching step and another, its unnatural form flowing across the room. I had nowhere to run. I was cornered. I could only watch as the abomination, the source of all my torment, came for me. It was 10 feet away, 5. It raised a long, multi-jointed limb. I closed my eyes, bracing for the end, and then the faintest hint of grey light touched the eastern window. The creature stopped. It cocked its head, a gesture of almost bird-like curiosity. It turned its blank face towards the window, towards the promise of the coming dawn. A low, guttural hiss emanated from it, a sound of static and grinding rocks. It seemed to shrink. The shadows that composed it grew less distinct, its form wavering like a heat haze. It took one step backwards, then another. It flowed back to the open trapdoor, poured itself down into the stairwell like smoke, and was gone. The first direct ray of sunlight pierced the horizon and lanced into the cabin. I was left alone on the floor in the wreckage of the trapdoor, shaking in the sudden brilliant light of a new day. I had survived. By sheer dumb luck, I had survived. An hour later, I heard the familiar rumble of a jeep. I looked out the window. It was Al, the real Al. He parked at the base and climbed the stairs, his face a mask of grim concern. He poked his head through the broken trapdoor, his eyes taking in the scene. The shattered lock, my catatonic state. He didn't look surprised. He looked profoundly sad. "It got in," he stated, not a question. I could only nod, my throat too tight to speak. He climbed the rest of the way into the cabin, a toolbox in his hand. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't offer comfort. He just went to the trapdoor and began methodically working on the broken frame. We have to report this." I finally managed to croak, my voice a dry rasp. "We have to warn someone." Al didn't look up from his work. "We will," he said, his voice flat. "Official log will say a grizzly tried to break in. Damage the entry hatch, happens all the time." He finally paused and looked at me, his eyes filled with a pity that was worse than any anger. "You did good, kid. You followed the rules. You survived." "Survived?" I asked, a hysterical laugh bubbling in my throat. "What's the point? It's just going to come back tonight." "Yes, it will," he said simply. "But its focus will be here, on this tower. That's the job, Leo. We're not here to watch for fires. We're lightning rods. We keep it occupied, contained in this small section of the park. As long as someone is here following the rules, it stays focused, it plays its games. The rest of the park stays safe." The truth of it, the horrifying cosmic absurdity of it, crashed down on me. I wasn't a ranger. I was a sacrifice, a living piece of bait in a cage. "So I can't leave," I whispered. Al finally finished his repairs, the new lock looking shiny and strong. "You can leave when your replacement arrives," he said, his gaze distant. "That's the deal. Someone always has to be in the tower. Someone has to pass on the rules." The cycle. The endless, horrifying cycle. David had replaced someone. I had replaced David. And someday, if I survived long enough, someone would come to replace me. My escape wasn't a matter of my own will, but of finding another soul to feed to the monster. The final scene is not from that day, but from 6 months later. The summer sun is high in the sky. I am standing at the base of the tower. I look different now. My face is thin. My eyes hold the same haunted, exhausted emptiness that I first saw in Al's. I hear a vehicle approaching. A dusty pickup truck, not a Park Service jeep. A young man gets out, his face bright with the same idealistic enthusiasm I once had. He is the new ranger, my replacement. He grins, extending a hand. "Leo? I'm Ben. It's an honor. Man, this place is incredible. I force a smile that doesn't reach my eyes and take his hand. My grip is brief. Welcome to Watchtower 4, I say, and my voice is gravelly, tired. It sounds just like Al's. Let's get your gear upstairs. There are a few things you need to know about the night shift. As we begin the climb, my free hand slips into my pocket. My fingers find the smooth, worn edges of the laminated paper. I am not being rescued. I am just a messenger, a single link in an unbreakable chain, passing the curse on to the next victim. As we ascend into the sky, I know that for Ben, the dream is just beginning. But for me, even as I walk away, the night will never, ever end.